Good afternoon. My name is Peter Bergen. Welcome to the New America Foundation. Very lucky to have Imitaz here. He's an old friend of mine. We actually met in the middle of a hijacking in Kandahar in 1999. It was a rather fateful hijacking because it led to the release of Omar Sheikh, who went on to kidnap and then facilitate the murder of Danny Pearl. It also produced the guy who founded Jaish Mohammed was released at the same time. Yeah, so it was an early warning of many of the things that were going to come out of Afghanistan. And Imitaz has been reporting on Afghanistan for many years. He was there under the Taliban frequently. He's reported often for the Deutsche Welle, the German outlet, also for the Friday Times, which is certainly, I think, the best Pakistani magazine, weekly magazine. His most recent book is The Most Dangerous Place on Earth, Pakistan's Lawless Frontier, which is an excellent account of the tribal regions and is also going to be released in paperback this spring. We're lucky also to have his editor here, Joy de Manil, who is herself, Joy, you can put up your hand, who is herself a real expert on Pakistan. And we were going to have this discussion more than a sort of, we thought it would be a good time to really just have a chat about what's going on and then open it up to your questions. And so, Imitaz, I guess the first question, I mean, the flood is arguably the most important political event in Pakistan's history. And you've done a lot of reporting on the flood. It always has seemed to me that Pakistan has some of the features of a pre-revolutionary state. As a society, its political class is not delivered particularly well for its very large population. And the flood is really a wild card that perhaps will shake things up in a positive way or perhaps in a negative way. How do you think, what are the ramifications of the flood? And to what extent has the Pakistani military benefited from its role in flood relief?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Peter, thank you very much. Good afternoon. It's always a pleasure to be here. I think it's a good occasion just to interact with the friends here. The super floods, as we call them, they really shook up the entire society, and I think they provided a lot of introspection opportunity to the Pakistanis, particularly I think the civil society. It exposed the inherent governance structures within Pakistan, partially perhaps also because the government structures or the government institutions were also flooded. I mean, you can imagine almost 20% of the territory coming under water, and then even government officials were also dependent and looking for help and rescue. So it was quite a shocking and moving, I think, happening in Pakistan. As I think we traveled from the north to the south, it looked like a serpent, the entire water, 5 rivers, then throwing their water into the mighty Indus, and which assumed the form of like a monster, displacing people, disrupting. And as we were traveling through the south, it looked that it had washed ashore poverty, poor people with their families. I mean, it was very, very depressing actually to see how the havoc that the water played with the people. Now, as for the military, whether it helped the military, its image. I mean, obviously the military remains Pakistan's most organized, the strongest institution, and particularly in a situation when the civilian government was seized more with its own fight for survival with the Supreme Court. The president, despite knowing that the water is coming, had become very clear on the 29th, 30th of July that there is going to be massive flood. He headed out to London and he wanted to visit his palace in Paris. The Prime Minister was out in central Punjab, central Pakistan, campaigning for one of his candidates. Rains were on, and so this was sort of the indifference that the political leadership at that time displayed. He was all dressed, in the 3-piece suit with the ties on, for almost 2 weeks, till everybody realized that there was the deluge coming up and it was displacing people. So in that situation, starting from, I think, the 30th of July, it was not the civilians or the civilian leaders who were out to help the flooded people. It was General Kayani, the army chief. It was quite interesting to see his pictures being splashed in the media and in the papers, and they also have a very good elaborate arrangement for their coverage in the form of the Inter-Services Public Relations Department. So 30th of July he was out, and 2nd, 3rd of August he was out visiting flooded areas. And actually the most interesting thing, which we found out later, that under the Pakistani constitution, the civilian government is supposed to call out the army for its support. It's an Article 245, I guess. The civilian government never did it. So it was the army that jumped into the fray itself. And I had a talk with a couple of senior generals that they said, we had a closed-door meeting on the 30th of July, then 2nd of August, and we were just waiting that the government, the Prime Minister, would ask us to come and help. But then the army chief said that let's go ahead, we'll see what happens thereafter, but because people have to be saved from water. I mean, my city is Peshawar, and we live, my entire extended family lives about 35 kilometers away from Nowshera, a town which stood in waters over 2 meters high for 7 days. So it obviously, I think the public memory is short anyway, almost everywhere. So you could see in the newspapers on these 16, 17 private television channels that it was army all around. So obviously it helped the rehabilitation of the image.
Now, the reports are that 7 million people are still homeless. Are they going to be homeless for an extended period of time, or are they being housed? And what is the, looking out over the next year, how is this going to be dealt with, if at all?
I think there are more than 500,000 families which lost their houses altogether, and it's largely farmers who had been living along the river banks all along, for this 2,200 kilometers from the north to the south. So you can imagine there was a lot of encroachment into the river basin itself over the years. Now, they were displaced. Obviously, in the north, most of the part is now dried up again. The waters have receded, but the south remains partially underwater, like 150 kilometers up to the Arabian Sea. But I think most of the farmers are still living in tents, and the outlook is not very good, just because the government is taking time to plan. They have, I think, handed out some $250 for each family as urgent, immediate relief. But the long-term planning is still taking place, and I think one big obstruction is most probably the integrity of the government, of the president. I think that is coming in the way, and that came in the way actually of immediate release of money or donations from outside. Although I must say, on the privately, people have been really, after initial reluctance, they came out with good numbers in the United States. In Germany, for instance, $210 million private people donated through television campaigns. So that was actually an outpour of sympathy for the people affected by the flood.
Well, but one of the disappointing things, I think, in this country was American civil society wasn't really that generous, relatively speaking, to, for instance, Americans were very generous after the Haiti disaster. And one of the reasons that people have speculated is that you have all these reports of corruption in the Pakistani government. Pakistan is the seat of all these insurgent and terrorist groups, and that Americans, private citizens, are pretty reluctant to give to Pakistan because they're concerned either their money is going to be wasted or it's going to go to the wrong people. Now, whether that's right or wrong, that's the impression. And By contrast, the American government has been quite generous. But I wanted you to contrast what happened with the earthquake in 2005 in Kashmir, where the United States played a lead role and a very obvious role and enjoyed quite a popularity surge as a result. And the fact that right now, if you have a U.S. flag on any kind of these aid shipments, people don't want the U.S. flag on an aid shipment in Pakistan. It's regarded as being very problematic. So what's changed in the last 5 years?
Well, I think the October 2005 earthquake was a unique opportunity in the sense that it provided an opportunity to a lot of people inside the country as well as outside to join ranks and help out the devastated people. It was, I would say, unprecedented. But what happened in the floods, you can also imagine the earthquake. It lasted for 10, 20 seconds, and within next couple of hours, we had lost 73,000 people. In the case of floods, in the words of the UN Secretary General, it was a slow motion tsunami. So the water, it rained and rained for over a week massively, and the water started moving. And you can imagine that the water, a week-long rains in the north, then reached the Arabian Sea after 6 weeks. So the water was gradually moving, and that's why you had like 1,700 people killed. It's not that massive, but the devastation. People lost their livestock partially. They lost their seeds for the next crop. They lost their stocks, food stocks, and you imagine it's the almost 1 million people who are marginalized in terms of cash anyway, who live, cash starve usually, so they live off barter. So when they lose their stocks, they're basically devastated. So this people realized only with the passage of time, and I think there was reluctance initially for 2 to 3 weeks. I got a lot of telephone calls within the United States, from Germany, from other countries for interviews, and everybody was asking, what about corruption? And this was quite a dilemma, that because we have a president who's tainted, whose past is tainted, and that I think came out as a big obstruction. But what we started telling people, this was the only argument I could give, that look, don't be so seized with corruption. Just think of the starving, dying people, drowning people. If 50 cents are going into somebody's pockets, you believe, the rest 50 cents is still going for the relief or rescue of somebody who really needs that help. So that's how probably this momentum built up gradually, and then there was, but it was not it's not comparable to what we witnessed in 2005.
What do you think is the state of the U.S.-Pakistani relationship right now?
Very bad.
Why?
Just because of conflicting interests. The U.S. Seems to be in a rush, the U.S. administration, to compel Pakistan into moving against all militant groups. It's frustrated with Pakistan still drawing distinction between good Taliban, bad Taliban, allies and friends and foes, whereas I think the United States would like to have an across-the-board action against all militant groups, whether it's the Haqqani network. Right now, I'm surprised it's the focus is just the Haqqani network in North Waziristan, as if he were the sole contributor to the insurgency and violence in Afghanistan, whereas I think it's a tripodal insurgency. You look at the bulk of the U.S. Troops, they are concentrated in the south. The Canadian 2,000 troops are also concentrated there. The British troops are largely deployed in that particular region, which suggests that the major target is Mullah Omar's Taliban, and it's not the Haqqani network. So it's a pretty, for me, a little mind-boggling how one element who was earlier a weaker link in the insurgency, the Haqqani network, can be characterized as the major source of violence inside Afghanistan. So this is, I think, and the Pakistani establishment, the ISI, has had good relations with the Haqqani network, with other Mujahideen fighters. So this would be one reason why they have been reluctant. But on the other hand, Haqqani is also protecting a number of people, like the Pakistani Taliban, the TTP faction. Their leaders are under protection of Haqqani. And this faction is attacking the interests of Pakistan. They have, I think, conducted until Monday morning 247 suicide attacks in the country in the last 7 years. So it's a question for us whether Haqqani can continue enjoying some sort of support, business relationship with the Pakistani establishment while he's protecting the enemies of the state of Pakistan.
I guess if a Pakistani official was here, or a Pakistani military official more specifically, they would say, look, we did this big operation in Swat in 2009, and we did a big operation in South Waziristan in 2009. We have to maintain 300,000 soldiers on our border with India. It's a 500,000 man army. We've got 140,000 in the tribal areas. We've got 34,000 in North Waziristan. We've got some people on vacation or on leave or whatever. And that we're doing what we can. And that now with the floods, even if we wanted to do something more significant in North Waziristan, we don't have the capacity. What would you say to that?
I think it's a question of more than willingness, of intent, and a very clear message from the top within the military establishment that we don't want to have anything to do with any group, any person who is opposed to the interests of Pakistan, who is opposed to the interests of any other country, whether it be the United States or Afghanistan. So this message has to be very loud and clear from within the military establishment. So I think once the military establishment is clear about that, I think then they would find ways how to enhance capacity and how to operationalize that capacity.
I mean, why wouldn't they do that with the Haqqani network if they are protecting people from the TTP?
Mm-hmm. Because the Haqqani network, or their leaders, Jalaluddin Haqqani, his son Sirajuddin Haqqani, that's reason number one, that they belong to a big tribe which is divided both sides of the border.
This is the Zadran tribe?
Zadran tribe, yeah. And obviously they have had old relationships. The governor of the Pakhtunkhwa province told me himself that somehow we have to maintain contacts for the contingencies, like there is an abduction for a high-profile person. So somehow you can't close or foreclose all your options by cracking down on every person. Our own ambassador was abducted in February 2009, and then they had to use the Haqqani network to get to the Taliban of Baitullah Masood and got him released against a ransom of $25 million, I understand, after 97 days. So I think it's a very intricate situation for Pakistan right now, that you wouldn't like to annoy somebody who is then sheltering your enemies. So this probably they're having this long-term view that we don't want to antagonize the Zadran tribe by directly cracking down on the Haqqani network. Secondly, North Waziristan obviously right now is a safe haven for a number of people, for splinter groups of Pakistani militant groups who had been operating in Indian Kashmir. So if you look at the kind of attacks that have taken place even at the heart of the Pakistan military, the General Headquarters, 10th of October last year. So they all, I think, suggest that the techniques, the tactics being applied are those which were applied in Kashmir against the Indian army. So, and they're obviously the splinter groups. And Haqqani is providing shelter to some of the Taliban, to the Tehreek-e-Taliban, TTP, and to Jaish-e-Mohammed, this is also a splinter group, and a couple of others. So, and these guys then have, on mainland Pakistan, they run hundreds of mosques and seminaries. So one consideration probably would be that if we attack them there, they can set Pakistan, the mainland Pakistan, on fire by releasing these suicide bombers, by creating violence conditions inside the country. So probably this would be one reason.
Do you think the campaign of suicide attacks, it seems to have maybe dropped down a little bit? I mean, a year ago it seemed to be particularly intense. It seems to be less frequent. I mean, the violence is still there.
Yeah.
And if that is the case, why is that happening?
Because the TTP, which is the prime source of suicide bombings, was disrupted from the Mahsoud area of South Waziristan. After the operation in October, they didn't have any secure place to continue their operations. So there were three big villages where they were headquartered, where they were training suicide bombers. That is number one. Number two, because of SWAT operation, a number of arrests have taken place, like hundreds of people. The army is still, I think, holding about 2,400 people, which are basically by Pakistani law a habeas corpus. You can't produce them before the normal courts. Why? Because the Anglo-Saxon law that is currently in vogue in Pakistan would find it very difficult for these people to stay in the jail. So any person being produced before the judge would most likely be bailed out. This is the fear, and this is what had happened also in 2008. So the state of Pakistan is in a sort of flux. I asked, for instance, the Interior Minister, what about the special law that the governor of that province had issued, under which you can try these culprits? And said, it has lapsed. Is it being reissued? He said, well, we don't know. Because we don't have law, so we can, the president or the governor of a particular province or state can issue a special decree that is called the ordinance, under which some people were being tried. That has lapsed, was not reissued. I asked the army, he said, well, ask the Interior Ministry. So there's a lot of confusion as well, and that shows how I think there's a sort of a confused state of mind that is currently ruling Pakistan.
What about Kiani's call or move to investigate the Pakistani army units who were engaged in killing these civilians, it looks like?
Yeah, that's a good move. The moment the news apparently reached him, then he ordered an inquiry into that. So.
And you're fairly familiar with his thinking, and senior Pakistani military officers thinking. You speak to them fairly routinely. What are they saying right now, to the extent that you can say, about the relationship with both the U.S. military and the U.S. government writ large?
Basically, the message that comes out is that we are finding it difficult to reconcile our long-term interests with those of the short-term interests of the United States. And the U.S. obviously would like to score a quick military victory in Afghanistan, whereas if Pakistan becomes partner in that quick victory, it will end up bruised heavily, particularly in the northwestern frontier province, which is the Pakhtunkhwa. And that would, I think, leave it with a number of tribal feuds, enmities, because there are about 18, 19 tribes that are living both sides of the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan. So the challenge right now is how to reconcile those conflicting interests. Somehow we have to, how do we marry it? We had this in foreign policy piece. Marrying conflicting interests is a big challenge right now.
In the piece that you kindly wrote for us on the AFPAC channel, there seemed to be a fair amount of anger amongst senior Pakistani military officials about, strangely, in particular, Petraeus himself. It seemed there was some, because they've had pretty warm relationships, but that seemed to have shifted.
Yeah, because they believe that General Petraeus is trying to implement his own vision in Afghanistan, trying to replicate his experiences, his Iraq experiences. And the impact would be the reverse. The American endeavor in Iraq, I think, has strengthened Iran in the region, in the sense that when the Americans went into Iraq, the presumption was, and the plan was actually, as we could see from the declassified documents very recently by the National Security Archives. The plan was to get Saddam. The plan was to use weapons of mass destruction as the excuse for invasion of Iraq. So in the process, the Americans ended up strengthening Iran because the majority population in Iraq is Shia. So the Iranians seized that opportunity. In the case of Pakistan, I mean, it's a huge country, and the insurgency is running within the religious elements, both sides of the border, whereas you have secular Pashtuns who are running that province. So somehow it will be very, very difficult to replicate the Iraqi experience in Afghanistan. And I think one source of concern for Pakistanis is that Petraeus has been given a mission of somehow creating conditions that project an American victory, and then that can perhaps become the basis for a gradual drawdown. Nobody is, I think, deluding him or herself that the Americans would withdraw from Afghanistan lock, stock, and barrel. But the fear is that if the bulk of the troops go back within next 4 or 5 months, then the Pakistanis shall have to take care of the problems that they inherited also after the Soviets and the Americans withdrew from Afghanistan in 1989-90.
So it sounds like you're saying the Pakistani senior military don't want the Americans to succeed too much, but they also don't want them to succeed too little.
I think it's not a question of succeeding too little or too much. I mean, probably the emphasis has been to address the Afghans' concerns as the concerns they have with Pakistan, to de-Americanize the effort, the entire peace effort, to create conditions which are conducive for dialogue among the Afghan factions, so that we see a de-escalation in the militarism that we see currently in Afghanistan. Because there's a direct correlation with the increase in the foreign troops and the violence. In Afghanistan, we started off with 5,000 foreign troops in October 2001. Now they are close to 140,000, but the violence has also quadrupled in the last 7-8 years. So you don't need to be a rocket scientist to conclude that injection of force and military has invited more trouble, more aggression from the other side. So somehow you have to find a way to de-escalate this militarism.
Yeah, I think in graduate school they say that correlation isn't causation. So, yes, the violence has gone up while the American troop presence has gone up, but there might be a whole series of other reasons why that's the case that have nothing to do with the rising number of boots on the ground. For instance, the Taliban essentially being defeated in 2001 and then coming back because they sort of regrouped in their safe havens, learned a little bit from the Iraqi insurgency in terms of the right tactics, the opium trade exploding, suddenly having a very large amount of money, importation of suicide tactics into Afghanistan in 2005. I think there were 17 suicide attacks in 2005 and then maybe 123 in 2006. There are other reasons that just because these things are happening simultaneously, the rising violence and the rising number of American boots on the ground, doesn't mean that they're actually causing each other. They could be, but there might be other reasons.
There are certainly other reasons. This is Al-Qaeda versus America. Al-Qaeda moved from, they were there in Afghanistan. They had their sort of safe havens, places where they could hide after their defeat in Afghanistan. So they settled down in Waziristan. The more, it's like it directly correlated. The Americans drew on more resources, Americans and NATO. They got into Afghanistan more people. The same way I think Al-Qaeda and Taliban also mobilized more resources. I think there was the dependence on drugs, on the transport mafia. A lot of Afghans and Pakistani tribal people are into the transport business. They are into smuggling. So I think this way they also then mobilized additional resources to counter the growing foreign involvement in that country. And obviously this is not just Pakistan, Afghanistan. It's about India, it's about Iran. Why should Iran? So it's basically the war between Al-Qaeda and America has turned Pakistan and Afghanistan into a battleground for several competing interests. they are competing interests of the United States, of Iran, of India, of Russia, of Pakistan, of course. I mean, how can Pakistan be denied the consideration for its own long-term national security interests? If other countries, thousands of miles away from the region, are seized with their national interests, so why shouldn't Pakistan watch its back? It has this 2,560 kilometer long border with Afghanistan. So somehow I see, as a Pakistani, I see like a selective application of universal principles, that the Americans or the Europeans, they are seized with their national interest, but they are not seized with the Pakistani interest. They are not discussing the kind of accumulative losses that Pakistan has taken in as a result of this partnership. You know?
Why is it that, I mean, this is a question that you see quite a lot on blogs about Pakistan written by younger Pakistani journalists. Why is it that the American drone campaign in Pakistan is so controversial, and yet there seems to be so little self-examination about the 247 suicide attacks you just discussed, and the extent to which, you know, these were, many of the people responsible for these attacks were at one point clients of the Pakistani state, and you've had this sort of huge blowback of this policy. And to what extent is there a sort of soul searching amongst, let's say, the Pakistani military about the issue of, you know, did we create a Frankenstein that's sort of out of our control now?
Well, this is what they say. I mean, I guess, as I said initially, there has to be more introspection. There has to be a very clear message from the top that this reliance on non-state actors, in the past, you know, there was a lot of reliance. They were used against India. It was considered as a cost-effective tool. But I guess there should be some introspection going on right now. When you talk to people in the foreign ministry, you talk to people in the interior ministry, as well as within the military, they realize that the challenge has simply become formidable, that we need a little more time now to deal with it. We can't overnight move against them. So I guess there is some introspection going on, but the question is of when and how quickly can you really operationalize your capacities to deal with this, neutralize it, if not totally eliminate it.
There was a report about several months ago that the ISI had come to some kind of quasi-official conclusion that militants inside Pakistan border was the main national security problem that the country faced. Do you think that, did you ever see that report, or was that report credible?
Well, I haven't seen any report. I wouldn't have access to that. Yeah. But what I can discern from the discussions is that, yes, they do think, I mean, what happened in Swat, for instance, in the spring of 2009, and what happened in South Waziristan, I think that was quite enough, I think, to open their eyes and to, I think, open a new chapter within the military establishment that, look, you know, whatever we did has fired back. So we need to do something. I guess there should be some realization, but again, the issue would be the medium to long term, how you really calibrate, because it's not Pakistan alone. So anything that is happening in Afghanistan is also impacted by Pakistan's relation with India. This is a complicated relationship. You know, the establishment within Pakistan, even the government, the Interior Ministry, we meet with a lot of people who say that there's this growing nexus, this Indo-American Afghanistan nexus. And this is, I think, why they are so paranoid about what's happening.
How can that paranoia be assuaged?
I don't know. This is actually a very huge challenge for Pakistan itself. And this would be, I personally have been thinking that the intelligence agencies of the 3-4 countries have to come clean, have to sit together. It won't happen without that, actually, until the intelligence apparatus of these countries sit together, come clean, and then take a decision. Look, we have to guard each other's interests rather than striking at each other.
Well, if India closed a couple of consulates in Afghanistan, would that make a difference?
Well, I think that's a trivial issue.
Yeah.
That's not fundamental to improvement of relations. they have just 4 consulates. As an independent country, Afghanistan has a right to award as many consulates to India as possible, and India as an independent country can establish as many consulates as possible. I don't think that's an issue for debate. It shouldn't be an issue, basically. But what Pakistan should be seized with is to how to extricate itself from this existential threat that is coming upon it as a result of this nexus between the Al-Qaeda, Haqqani, and the Pakistani Al-Qaeda organization. I call them the Pakistani Al-Qaeda organizations.
What role does the Pakistani government have in reconciliation, quote unquote, with the Taliban? What role should it have? What role does it have? Are the reports of Mullah Barada being released, do you think, are those true?
Mullah Barada, that's actually an interesting story. Joy also wanted me to talk about that in the book. There's been actually one narrative that came through in the US media that originated in Kabul about Mullah Barada, who was the top commander of the Afghan Taliban, why he was arrested. One narrative said that he was arrested because he was talking to the Afghan president and to the Americans, and Pakistanis didn't like it. The other narrative that I stumbled upon recently is that Mullah Barada actually came to Karachi to collect a huge consignment of money that was coming from Dubai, donations that they gather, and some businesses that some of the Taliban supporters run in the Gulf states, that he actually himself went to receive that consignment at the Karachi airport. The authorities missed him there, but when he was on the way to Balochistan from Karachi, out of Karachi, the CIA was also tracking him. So then it became a sting joint operation of the ISI and CIA to get hold of him. So this is a narrative that I stumbled upon very recently, and this basically contradicts. And the Pakistanis say that perhaps he can be used to convince Mullah Omar for talks, for getting to the negotiation table, which he is not willing at the moment. There's a lot of frustration within the Pakistani government and the military that Mullah Omar is not listening. They have requested, apparently, the Saudi Arabians, which still has a big clout. Actually, the Saudi Arabian role goes ignored, unnoticed. The funding that they provide to people like Rasul Sayyaf, to organizations like Sepah-e-Sahaba, Pakistan Inside Pakistan, to Lashkar-e-Taiba. So the Saudi Arabians have been now requested for persuading Mullah Omar to allow his people to talk, to open up for negotiations, basically. What is the result? We don't know. They're still continuing with their efforts.
Well, if you don't know where Mullah Omar is, how do you get in touch with him to persuade him to?
Oh, you are presuming. Look, there are always people, intermediaries, who would get you to Mullah Omar. It's not a big deal, I guess. You have.
It would be kind of a coup if you found him. I did an interview with him.
No, I wouldn't have a chance, actually.
Okay.
I think it's not a deep. As I said, the governor, explained to me the dynamics of the region, that you have to keep many options open, many windows open, to be able to then operate in contingency situations. And there'll be a lot of people, traders, who have been former allies of Mullah Omar, allies of Gulbuddin Hikmatyar and of Haqqani, and people can get through to them. And the intelligence agencies, I think, would have somehow links to them.
Yes. Shall we, on that note, open it to questions? And if you want to ask a question, please identify yourself and your affiliation. Questions are encouraged, not lengthy statements. Go ahead, Matt.
My name is Khawar and I'm from Pakistan, freelance journalist. My question to Imitaz is about the political support to this, extremism in Punjab, especially. We do talk about Pashtunkhwa and other areas, but they're very small. In fact, understanding of Punjab government, where the Punjab is more than the rest of the Pakistan, 60 plus percentage of population, and larger number of the bases like Lashkar-e-Taiba or Jaish-e-Mohammed or LashkarJhangvi, you just take the name, are based in Punjab. But there are some reports that Punjab government is very reluctant to take any serious action against these very, very organized groups. And somewhere there are alliances, rather, with Sipa Sahaba, another group for the political reasons and election. So how you look at Punjab government, which is supposed to be, in fact, a government in waiting after next election?
Yes, basically political considerations, social considerations, I think that have allowed these groups to prosper, which is very, very unfortunate that just for one constituency or one seat in the national legislature, sometimes it's the ruling Pakistan People's Party and sometimes it's the Muslim League of former Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif, who just try to condone the activities of these groups. But however, you have to draw a distinction between Lashkar-e-Jhangvi, and this may be too much for the audience here.
No.
Yeah, Lashkar-e-Jhangvi is being sought after, not Lashkar-e-Taiba. It is a banned organization, but they have been used as a tool in Indian Kashmir until a couple of years ago, very clearly. And the Mumbai attacks, I think, again, still are casting a very ominous shadow on the relations with India. But Lashkar-e-Jhangvi doesn't officially run any madrasa or any seminary, whereas Lashkar-e-Taiba does. Now, Lashkar-e-Taiba, one question to ask is whether it has attacked the interests of Pakistan, whether it has conducted any suicide attack inside Pakistan, whether it has attacked the Pakistan army. So the question would be, it's operating under a different name, right? The question would be, what would be the ground for any offensive police action or military action against Lashkar-e-Taiba, for instance? So I'll be surprised if you had any answer to that.
Jaish-e-Mohammed and Sipa Sahaba, those all have their presence in tribal areas. They are running their camps. And Masood Azhar supposed to be in Punjab, and he was house arrest, and then he disappeared.
Yeah.
And whenever you, especially the south of Punjab, is becoming a new tribal area, very, very fast. So all these, it is providing a lot of logistic support to these fighters coming from other countries, and there's so many happening there. But if we talk to the Punjab government administration or some officials there, they don't even recognize or acknowledge that something is happening.
You're right. This is still a state of denial within the political circles, and particularly the right-wing political parties. I mean, it's very unfortunate. And yes, I mean, they should not condone, they should not partner, actually, ideally, with any of these groups.
LashkarJhangvi, to explain who they are and what their target set is and what their strength is. LashkarJhangvi is a splinter. Basically, we had in 1947, when Pakistan was created, one Jamiat Ulama-e-Islam, JUI party. So then it splintered into many groups. And LashkarJhangvi is one militant organization which was originally part of a Sipahe Sahaba group. And that was funded by the Saudis very clearly in response to the Iranian Revolution. So you had that stream of funding coming from the radical Sunni groups inside Pakistan from Saudi Arabia. And then it splintered off. Then it started attacking the police. It was involved in a number of sectarian attacks on Shia mosques, Shia processions. It was outlawed in January 2002, although that ban didn't mean much actually. But somehow the government or the police couldn't really take any conclusive, definitive action against the group. They are just operating. There's been a low-level Shia-Sunni civil war going on in Pakistan for decades. Do you think it's getting worse?
Yeah, until there's a the real crackdown, on these alliances until the government and the political parties really take this decision that we have nothing to do with any of the groups, regardless of what. Out of political experience, they fall back upon one person or the other person who happens to be directly or indirectly related with one of the radical groups. And I think that creates distortions, and that creates basically space for these groups to operate. And they draw sort of legitimacy, official patronage that way to operate. And also I think we also have to think of very poor governance structures in Pakistan. The South Punjab, for instance, has a population of 42 million. And in that region, the citizen to police ratio is like 700 citizens are guarded by just one policeman. Whereas it should be much better, I would say. So,
Barbara Starr did an interview with a senior NATO official with responsibility for the Afghan war. I think we can judge who probably that official was. And he said that Mullah Omar is traveling between Quetta and Karachi now. Were you surprised by that?
No.
You think Mullah Omar could be in Karachi?
Could be anywhere.
Yeah, well, that's true.
Because, I think if it's also, I would say, the failure of the FBI or the CIA as well. If the ISI hasn't delivered, they also fail. Because right now, there's a lot of a big intelligence network of informers for this FBI, for the CIA within Pakistan. So if they have been able to pick up people from Rawalpindi, just next door to the military headquarters, from Peshawar, from Karachi, from Faisalabad, they should have been able, if he's traveling that frequently to between Karachi and Quetta and Kandahar, they should have been able to pick him up sometime the way they picked up Mullah Brother.
This is Ian Wilkie, Archer Analytics. Question for both Peter and Imitaz, picking up a little on Peter's mention of Barbara Starr's piece, and that came on the heels, Peter, as you recall, of a blog entry by Paul Cruikshank, which said that Bin Laden was in the Northwest Territories providing, I think in the words of the NATO intelligence official that Cruikshank was referring to also anonymously, strategic direction. So there's obviously some sort of refuge where Bin Laden and Zawahiri are able to live outside the purview and reach of the drones. And I wonder, Imitaz, if you would first give your opinion of the Chitralis as a population that might be a likely provider of refuge for America's #1 enemy. And then also, if you could just speak to both this report about Bin Laden providing strategic direction from Pakistan, and also whether or not there is this refuge where Bin Laden and Zawahiri live in separate houses but not far away from each other. Thanks.
I wish I knew. I would have pocketed $50 million if you were somewhere there. Chitralis, I think, largely they are Aga Khani Muslims. So they...
what Muslims?
Aga Khan. They
Ismaili.
Ismailis,
Yeah.
So I don't think that there he would find any refuge. He could be there, if at all he is alive, could be there in the mountain. It's a huge mountainous terrain. It's all a matter of speculation. Look, I'm there 7, 8 years.
Further to say, though, that ISI members were protecting him up there, and they didn't delineate whether or not they were
I would say this
former or renegade, and I would think that those adjectives would add a great deal to the story.
If this belief runs so deep, they should put it on record. This official spokesman of the US or of the NATO should say it on record. And just attributing it to some anonymous spokesperson or anonymous military officer and doesn't mean much for me. I would have rather had it from the headquarters in Brussels or from Pentagon here, that here is the person who we believe is protecting Osama Bin Laden somehow, even in closed-door meetings. So I personally don't believe there's, after 9/11, what has happened, there's a lot of degradation also, decline in the reporting, professional reporting. That the Associated Press, AFP, for instance, I've been doing myself this news agency.
Peter's colleagues we're talking about.
Sorry?
These are Peter's colleagues.
They were also my colleagues. So we all suffered the same, actually. I mean, we fell out, basically, just because I, as a...
the Star and the Cruikshank sources?
anybody's sources, anything that appears, well, they are not biblical words. Look, come on.
Quranic.
Yeah, they are not biblical words, and I know. May I say something? You know, if last year, which may be interesting to you, but I'm talking about the professional dishonesty that has been taking place in the last 9 years. When the Taliban came down after the peace deal, like to one of the areas, Bunair, and the news agencies started crying, flashing the news, Taliban just 100 kilometers, 150 kilometers away from Islamabad, right? It was interesting. It must have been 5th or 6th of May. And I, out of curiosity, checked up with one of my friends who happens to be in one of the 3 major news agencies, Reuters, AP, and AFP. I wouldn't name the agency because almost everybody was running the same headline. So I asked my friend, can you tell me what triggered that Taliban 100 miles away from Islamabad? And he said, look, you know, we were sitting together when we heard the news that they had come down and occupied certain places. And he said, our bureau chief picked up a map and said, where is Bunair? And he looked at it and then he measured it with a finger or with whatever, you know. And they worked out it was 100 miles, right? So then he said, we told him that it's not 100 miles, it's more than that because it's a mountainous terrain, you can't take a direct flight from Pune to Islamabad, right? But the bureau chief, who happens to be a foreigner, a Brit or an American, he went ahead with the headline. And there have been 3 such instances ever since. I wouldn't go into more details, but I'm just talking about the professional dishonesty and the decline in the reporting formats. So I wouldn't take anybody anonymous's words as biblical words.
Let me just comment on the where Bin Laden is question. You know, we spent $500 billion on our intelligence since 9/11, and we don't know where Bin Laden is. We don't know where Ayman al-Zawahiri is, and we don't know where Mullah Omar is. And if these were private companies instead of the U.S. intelligence community, we would have fired their management. Their stock would be trading near zero because one of their primary missions has not been accomplished. And I think it's not easy to find people. It took a dozen years to find Karadzic in the Balkans. It took the Israelis 15 years to find Eichmann in Latin America. You know, finding one person, particularly in the Northwest Frontier Province, which is almost certainly where he is not easy. But you know, this information that the government has said, either to Barbara Starr or to anybody else, it's the same information for the last 9 years. I've been told exactly the same stories, and I think they're accurate. But saying somebody's in the Northwest Frontier Province of Pakistan is like saying somebody's in Virginia, quite literally. It's not a very useful way of finding somebody. It's a big place. And so what we have are informed suppositions about where Bin Laden is. We don't have intelligence. There hasn't been no intelligence about Bin Laden's actual location since December 14th, 2001, when radio intercepts in Tora Bora definitively showed that Bin Laden was either there or had just left. And that was according to multiple sources. In fact, if you look at this Special Forces history of the Battle of Tora Bora, which is available online, you will see that all source reporting between December 9th and December 14th established that Bin Laden was at Tora Bora. But since then, there's been nothing. And, Bin Laden will be caught. He's only 54, so he's not going to die of natural causes anytime soon. But but it could be a long time. I mean, we could be having this conversation 10 years from now, and I think Bin Laden, who will then be 64, will still be around. I think it's, he faces a quandary, which is he can either say nothing and basically become irrelevant, or he says something and that opens him to discovery, because the chain of custody of these audio tapes are the one way to find him. And just a final comment on the question of where he is. A guy called Daniel Kimmage did a paper for us, a very clever paper recently, in which he did an analysis of al-Qaeda's statements, and he found that 70% of them, I think, some very large number, are now about Afghanistan and Pakistan. People tend to talk about things that are immediate in their environment. And so look at Bin Laden's last statement. Look at Ayman al-Zawahiri's last statement. 2 of Bin Laden's last statements were about the Pakistani floods, and as was Zawahiri. So they're obviously in Pakistan. This is the frontal lobe issue for them. And by the way, Ayman al-Zawahiri and Bin Laden have spent more time in Afghanistan and Pakistan than in their native countries. Bin Laden arrived when he was around 22 into Pakistan, and Ayman al-Zawahiri arrived when he was in his, around 30. And they spend a great deal of time. They know this area well. Going back to the Haqqanis, these guys have known the Haqqanis since 1982. Haqqani speaks Arabic. He's married, got an Arab wife. That's where these guys are. They're pretty comfortable where they are.
Yeah. Does it answer your question?
What do you think about very contradictory perception in Washington about Pakistan? On the one hand, we say that Pakistan is a totally failed state. It cannot pay the salary of its employees without getting foreign debt from private sector or from different governments. But then we go around and think that Pakistan would take care of these problems that US has been unable to do for the last 9 years.
Good point.
And the other thing is that do Pakistani establishment, foreign policy establishment, think about their failure? They couldn't get US influence to resolve Kashmir issue. They couldn't get any major project in Pakistan with the help of US. You talk about accumulative losses that Pakistan has been losing in terms of opportunity. They are billions of dollars. And comparing to that, what US is giving is nothing to Pakistan. So I mean, eventually I feel like Pakistani people, they would get so angry that they have to bring some kind of a revolution, because everyone is kind of cheating them, exploiting them, including Pakistani army, including the US here, because it's only poor people who suffer from Pakistan, not elite.
Question or just...
Okay, so I mean, they even don't have faith in their own country. Pakistani elite don't keep their money in Pakistan, they keep abroad. So my question is, when do you expect any kind of revolution in Pakistan from poor people who are being exploited by everyone? Thanks.
I lost the question. Well, I don't expect any revolution. But right now, I would say Pakistan is finding itself in a very, very defining moment. If you look at the way the Supreme Court is conducting itself, and if you look at the way the private television, which has emerged as a very, very strong pillar of this fragile democracy, it is conducting itself. Like, we have more than 52 private channels, among them 16 or 17 news channels, and they are also serving as a censor not only on the Supreme Court but also on the government. I think I was going through actually this Newsweek article. It describes Pakistan as an indispensable but dishonest partner. So this is a quandary, and I think Bob Woodward's book also clarifies that.
Don't Pakistanis feel the same way about the United States?
Yeah. No doubt about it, actually. If you look at various surveys that have been conducted, so the United States is not viewed favorably. Actually, I would say, in Pakistan, most of the reactions, most of the statements, they are quite emotion-based. They're not rational statements. And that's why you would see that a lot of, despite this help coming in the earthquake in 2005, even now, I think the US has committed a lot of resources to Pakistan. The overall picture would remain unfavorable, just because there's a narrative that is doing the rounds, narrative coming from Al-Qaeda, from the Taliban, and the US role in Iraq, in Afghanistan also then feeds into that narrative. And that, I think, that also fuels the public sentiment against the United States, which I personally think is unfair. But because there is so much politically, people are so frustrated with their own politicians, with their own military, that then they refuse to see logic. They judge things through heart, not through their mind.
Yes, Mike Pevsner, U.S. Senate staff. Thank you very much for the very informative talk. I wonder if the message that the U.S. policymakers bring over periodically to Pakistan, visits by the CIA director, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and so on, it seems like the last administration was very much a status quo policy. During the Obama administration, there's been more of an emphasis on economic development, though the argument can be made that it's not been nearly enough. I think 7.2 billion over 5 years, plus now another possible 2 billion. I was reading in the press. At the same time, every time there's a threat, and most specifically after the gentleman in Times Square, there is a visit by senior U.S. policymakers to stiffen the spine of the Pakistani military to go after the groups that they aren't going after. But again, as Peter pointed out, I think that's the same story that I've been seeing for at least the last 5 to 7 years. The question, though, is should an attack take place? And this I think Bob Woodward talked about a little bit with contingency planning for a U.S. response. How serious is the message that should be sent by the United States to the Pakistani government? What should be said that isn't being said now to change the calculus? I wonder if you'd have any insight on that. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. And actually, Imitaz is sort of a part two to that, because even more likely than an attack on the United States from Pakistan, large scale, is an attack in India that is traceable to Pakistan. And to what extent have the Indians clearly have some sort of contingency plan, which I think would probably involve taking out training camps in Azad Kashmir, perhaps, or what, can you talk about what likely reactions there might be on the Indian side? And
just one more follow-up, I'm sorry. Just looking at the article that Ambassador Khalilzad recently had, it seems like there is some shift of opinion. Maybe the status quo can continue indefinitely, but aside from the threat of a Times Square, there's always the daily litany of 2, 3, 4, 5 young American guys that are dying in Afghanistan. So that the status quo there doesn't seem to be sustainable either. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. I think the Newsweek has done a great article in its latest issue, and this probably conveys the message to the Pakistanis. If I may quote from this, but America cannot extricate itself from Afghanistan without first reversing the Taliban's momentum. It really is AFPAC. In other words, not PACAF, at least for the moment. That means, now this is instrumental. That means we have to pursue our interests as ruthlessly as we can, regardless of whether they damage Pakistan's interests or its ego. I think it makes it quite clear what the message is. It has been unambiguous the past 9 years. Now, to what extent does the Pakistan military establishment and the Pakistan government react to it? I don't know. I think we'll see in the coming months how they calibrate their long-term and medium-term interests with this demand. As for the attack, another attack, Mumbai-like attack in India, yeah, if that were to happen, that obviously brings both countries to the brink once again. But I would still, I think, rule out a full-fledged war between the two countries. Even the Indians probably wouldn't dare coming into Pakistan and trying to take out whatever camps there are in Kashmir or elsewhere in Pakistan, because that would be, I think, an invitation to probably use weapons of mass destruction. That will be suicidal, I would say. So I don't think Indians would do that. And actually, there was an occasion in 2000, immediately after Mumbai attacks, when there was a string of dignitaries from Washington, including Senator John Kerry, and they suggested to the president at that time that, well, let the Indians do something. They need to appease their own people because they are outraged. And President Zardari conveyed this to the army chief and to the prime minister in a meeting. And the moment the president suggested this, so the prime minister then nodded in negative and said, I think politically it would not be correct if we allowed them to do something, conduct a strike inside Pakistan and let it go unchallenged. And the army chief then, we were told, said that at no cost. People will lynch us in Pakistan if the Indians were to conduct a strike into Pakistan, because that would basically destroy our own existence, challenge our existence. So I think it will be very suicidal if the Indians try to do that.
In back?
Nadeem Yaqub, Voice of America. My question, you spoke about the conflicting interests in Afghanistan of the United States and Pakistan. Recently, there was this, we had this strategic dialogue here between the two countries. Do you think that will kind of help in bridging the gap between the interests, between the two countries?
I mean, it's a third strategic dialogue. So, I mean, the fact that there are these regular talks, surely that kind of helps even, there are always ups and downs in these relationships. And, I think both sides understand that that there are, that they kind of have to get on. But don't you think the strategic dialogue is useful, or is it just window dressing?
I don't think it's window dressing. I think it will take both countries, bring both countries closer than ever. This engagement must continue, and this will be, I think, in the long run, very, very useful. This can certainly bridge the trust deficit.
In the front here.
Varun Vera, AEI. My question was with regard to the reconciliation talks that are happening right now. The main thing is that they seem to be cutting out Mullah Omar out of the talks. Do you believe that the Pakistani security establishment thinks that it can advance its interests in a post-American Afghanistan without the Haqqanis or Mullah Omar? Or do you think they have other members of the Quetta Shura that they think can sort of deliver for them?
Well, they have to, I think, consult with everybody. Cutting one out and taking in the others won't work. We've experienced it the last 7-8 years. It didn't work. It will not work. If somebody thinks, that they can settle this issue or bring some semblance of normalcy in Afghanistan by ignoring Mullah Omar or Hikmatyar, I think that they are grossly mistaken.
How would you characterize the history of Pakistani government negotiations with the Pakistani Taliban and the extent to which the Pakistani Taliban kept to their side of the bargain in any of these peace agreements?
I think that was actually very bad diplomacy that Pakistan government indulged in these peace deals with the Taliban, because we, as members of civil society, have been opposing this. This basically means you're ceding ground. You're appeasing the militants the moment you start accepting their conditions.
And by the way, if you feel that way in Pakistan, why wouldn't you feel that way in Afghanistan too?
Yeah, this is how it happens. Yeah. How it should happen. Look, there was after the elections in 2008 in Pakistan, it was the political party in the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province which requested the army to let it handle the SWAT militants. They said, okay, go ahead. So there was a ground prepared for that.
This is the secular Pashtun.
The secular Pashtun Awami National Party. And it requested this in March 2008. In May, it told the military that, sorry, we can't handle this. They had thought that because everybody believed that it needs a political settlement, it needs a political dialogue. But eventually what transpired that the militants in Swat region, they were not interested in any peace deal. They were just projecting their power there. They were just trying to capture that area. And the same thing was repeated again in 2009. The second peace deal, which both the military as well as the Awami National Party were on board. But what transpired? Nothing. They were again using it to get their people released from the jails. And the entire effort backfired. So I think they apparently learned a bitter lesson from that these people are not there for Sharia or for Islamic justice system. This was just a ruse, a pretext for acquiring a particular region.
Well, just to follow up on that, every single deal the Pakistani government has done with the Pakistani Taliban has been a failure by almost any measure, right?
Yeah, I would say so, yeah. Basically,
so, what does that mean? What does that mean for a deal with the Taliban writ large as regards to Afghanistan? If every deal the Pakistani government has done with the Pakistani Taliban has been a failure, What does that mean for this whole question of reconciliation?
Well, it's the Taliban who were born out of the ISI-CIA partnership. So, it's a different calculus altogether. It was the same guys who we all sponsored at that time. And now, whether it's Haqqani, Hikmatyar, or Mullah Omar, they are the Afghans. They are Afghans. They are not outsiders. And if somebody believes that you can basically bring about peace in Afghanistan without involving those people, they are fighting fighting against the occupation forces in Afghanistan. But what is happening in Pakistan is that they also commit themselves to the liberation of Afghanistan, but in the process they are also attacking the interests of Pakistan. So I think you have to draw a distinction between, this is Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, for instance. It openly says because the Pakistan army and the government is collaborating with the United States, we have a reason to attack the interests of Pakistan government.
If you were advising President Obama, what would you advise him on these issues?
Give us a break.
Sorry, it's not an easy question.
No. Well, I don't know. I don't want to be an advisor to Obama actually in these circumstances, because they are driven by a very, very ambitious agenda. I see there are a lot of financial economic problems within the United States, and I think this is what is frustrating not only the Obama administration but also I think the security establishment. So somehow they have to be dispassionate as far as Pakistan's this quote-unquote double dealing is concerned. They have to provide some space, I guess, to Pakistan to deal with its own problems, which will start actually with Pakistani military and ruling political elite looking inwards as well. The first step is introspection at home. As I said initially in the beginning, that we really have to make a very clear decision that there is no space for any religiously driven organization, non-state actor in this country, neither here nor in Afghanistan. No condonation for that. And thereafter, I think we have to set a number of things right at our own home, like the ruling elite. They have to pay taxes. The GDP tax to ratio is abysmal, like just 9%. On less than, I think, 1 million people pay direct taxes, which doesn't mean anything. 78%. There's 78% indirect taxation for the entire population. So there are a lot of things that I think we have to set right before we expect others to help us.
Imitaz, what has happened to the idea about having a one-time tax on the rich to pay for flood relief? Did that go anywhere?
Well, that's firefighting. I mean, that doesn't help in the long run.
Sure, understood.
We are talking of any amount of taxation. Look, the taxation system is tailored to benefit the rich more. In the last 20 years, the tax burden on the dominant majority of Pakistanis, for the poor, let's say, who are living of less than $2 a day, has gone up by almost 18%. The taxation on the rich, it has gone up. The taxes for the poor have gone up by almost 18%. For the rich, it has come down by 26%. This is a couple of economists who have worked this out.
Sounds like the United States.
Really?
Okay, we're going to gather some
questions.
We're
partners anyway.
We're going to gather some questions. We have a few minutes left,
Yeah.
and so just if we can sort of pool questions and you can just...
Yeah, maybe you can respond.
Frank Kelleher from the World Bank. Could you speak a bit about Musharraf's decision to return to the political fray in Pakistan, what the likelihood may be for his return to power, assuming that this issue with the judiciary could be resolved? Thank you.
Well, I hope he doesn't return to Pakistan.
If he returned to Pakistan, wouldn't he either face the danger of being put in prison or being assassinated?
Yeah, that is the imminent danger to his life. Yeah, I think we have had enough of Musharraf, and I would request all of you not to put your eggs again in his basket. We made him prominent. We turned him from a pariah into a statesman by partnering with him in this questionable coalition against a war against terrorism. So let's not do it again. Let the people of Pakistan sort it out within Pakistan. You know, it's a person, just on a lighter note, one of the students with whom I had learned German language together after my university went on to become the chief of one of the intelligence services in the southern Sindh province. Like, we met after 23 years sometime in 2006. And he told me that the last 2 years, like 2006 and 2007, we were just there to protect and promote Mr. Musharraf. And he was one of the 5 key people heading that intelligence agency. So you can imagine, I mean, that they spent all the force, all their energies on protecting him. And 12th of May 2007 was the blackest day under Musharraf, when he allowed this ethnic MQM party in Karachi to block the arrival of the Chief Justice of Pakistan. At that time, he was suspended. And this intelligence guy told me that we were told to stay away. So we had nothing to do with the obstructions. That day, 45 people died in the violence that the MQM perpetrated. And then in the evening, a drunk Musharraf appeared at a public rally in Islamabad, telling the people, "You have seen the power of the people on the streets of Karachi today, this morning." So he's a person I wouldn't like to even see after what he, I think, imposed on Pakistan for 2 years, more than 2 years, the 2006 and 2007. So I wouldn't want him back, actually.
Okay. Final question.
Yes, my name is Ann Sweetser. I'm a social anthropologist, so this is out of my area a bit. But it seems to me, you've mentioned Saudi Arabia, but in some ways China is the elephant in the discussion. It's an economic and military enemy of India. It's worried about its own restive population in the West. It's been a silent and strong partner of Pakistan for years. It's giving atomic energy plants. It's got, 2 years ago, it had 80,000 people doing fast and competent construction work and mining and all sorts of stuff. Pakistanis are not studying Mandarin. And is the government being naive in not looking at the longer-term consequences of a passive acceptance of so much from China?
What is negative as far as in this, and this all business commercial activity that Chinese are, they're doing business with Pakistan.
Some people would say that they're just trying to get a foot in the door, and that later they will use their position in the country as a way of getting at India, or certainly getting to the ocean, or that Pakistan may find itself compromised in ways that it is not presently anticipating.
They're putting their foot in the door to prevent what they perceive the Indian foot from getting into that door. So it's like competing interests of India trying to gain foothold in Afghanistan, China trying to protect its waterways. You know, they consider the entire Indian Ocean very critical for their import-export, basically exports. I think they don't import much. So they're doing business with every country. So are they with Pakistan. I think they gave the nuclear energy, nuclear power reactor, or centrifuges and some missiles, I think, back in the 1980s. Thereafter, I don't think there have been any need from Pakistan. Yeah, ring magnets, I think we got from them in the early 1990s for the small Kahuta nuclear plant. But yeah, there's a strategic relationship both countries find themselves in, and they've stood by each other in crunch times.
Imitaz, thank you so much for that.
Yep.